It feels like things are changing pretty quickly when it comes to cannabis, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely been a pretty big shift in a lot of places.
I mean, we're seeing countries like Canada and Uruguay going full on legalization.
Right. And then you've got a bunch of U.S. states kind of following suit.
It's almost like with it becoming more visible and talked about, especially among younger folks, there's this growing idea that maybe it's not such a big deal.
Yeah, like maybe it's pretty harmless.
Exactly. Harmless. But that's what we're going to dig into today.
Well, it's fascinating because this kind of growing social acceptance, it seems to run right up against some of the new stuff that's coming out from the research world, especially when you really zero in on specific mental abilities and how they're affected, particularly in certain age groups.
So that's exactly what we're doing in this deep dive. We're going to really focus on one specific cognitive skill,
Okay.
visuospatial processing,
All right.
and how using cannabis might be affecting it, specifically in high school students who aren't dependent on the substance.
Right. So we're talking about teenagers who might use cannabis, but they haven't been diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder or dependence or anything like that.
That's a really important distinction to make, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
We're not focusing on, people who are struggling with a cannabis use disorder, but more like a broader population of young people who are using cannabis and how it might be affecting them in more subtle ways.
Now, visuospatial processing, it kind of sounds like a mouthful, you know?
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us a little bit? What exactly are we talking about here?
Basically, think of it as your brain's ability to understand and work with visual and spatial information.
Okay.
So it's how you make sense of what you see, how you picture things in your mind, how you understand where things are in space relative to each other,
Right.
and importantly, how you can manipulate those mental pictures in your working memory.
So like mentally rotating shapes or something.
Exactly, that kind of thing. And this skill, it really underlies so much of how we interact with the world.
Oh.
It's involved in how we perceive things, how we pay attention, how we remember information, and ultimately how we learn.
So the real core of what we're looking at here is, could using cannabis, even without dependence, be messing with this very fundamental brain skill in young learners?
Yeah.
Because if it is, well, that could have some pretty big downstream effects on how well they do in school, right?
Exactly. That's the big question.
And luckily, we've got some research here that's starting to shed light on that connection.
Yeah, and the research really highlights just how crucial visuospatial processing is for doing well academically, especially in those STEM subjects, your science, technology, engineering, math.
Because this isn't just some abstract brain function that's happening in isolation.
Right.
What we're seeing in these sources is that this stuff really matters in a classroom setting.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to do well in math and science, it seems like making sure your visuospatial skills are sharp is just as important as knowing all the formulas and stuff.
Okay, so let's look at what the research actually says then. What specific connections are we seeing here?
Well, one really interesting study found that there's actually a pretty strong connection between visuospatial skills and how well kids do in math.
Okay.
Like, they did this big review of a bunch of studies, and they found that there's a medium to large correlation there.
So it's not just like a random coincidence.
Exactly. It seems like there's a real relationship there.
Okay. What else are we seeing in the research?
Well, they did this experiment with ninth graders.
Okay.
These are kids who are around 15, 16 years old.
Okay.
And they gave them some specific tests that are designed to measure visuospatial processing. Things like the mental rotations test, where you have to look at 3D shapes and figure out if they're the same after they've been rotated, and the visual patterns test.
Right. Right.
And what they found was that how well those ninth graders did on those visuospatial tests actually predicted how well they would do on their regular math tests.
So the kids who were good at mentally rotating shapes were also good at math.
Pretty much, yeah. And what's interesting is that how they did on tests of verbal skills or executive function, like planning and problem solving, that didn't predict their math scores as well.
So those visual and spatial skills were really key.
Exactly. And another study with ninth graders, they found something similar.
Okay.
They found that the mental rotations test was a good predictor of their grades in geometry, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, lots of shapes and angles and stuff in geometry.
Exactly. And the visual patterns test was a good predictor of their mental arithmetic skills.
It's like different parts of visuospatial processing are linked to different kinds of math abilities.
That's what it seems like, yeah.
So is this just something that we see in older kids, or does it start even earlier?
Well, they did some research with kids aged 11 to 13, And they found that both their visuospatial working memory and their verbal working memory were important for their math and reading performance.
Okay.
But the visuospatial processing part uniquely predicted additional success in math.
Hmm. Interesting. So even at that younger age, those visual and spatial skills were giving them a leg up in math.
Exactly. It seems to give them an extra edge.
What other studies did they look at?
Well, there's a study with 11-year-olds,
Right.
and they used a task called the spatial span, which measures spatial working memory,
Okay.
and another visuospatial task called the odd one out task, where you have to look at visual patterns and figure out which one doesn't belong.
Okay, I get it.
And both of those tasks, they were significantly correlated with the kids' test scores, not just in math, but also in English and science.
Wow. So this visuospatial processing stuff is really important across the board.
That's what it seems like, yeah. How well you can work with visual and spatial information in your mind, it seems to really contribute to how well you do in school, especially in math and science.
So we've talked about how important this skill is for learning.
Right.
But now, let's get to the heart of what we're really looking at today. What happens to this skill when cannabis use enters the picture?
Right, so our sources actually looked at two different types of studies.
Okay.
Some were experimental studies, where they actually had people use cannabis and then tested their visuospatial processing right away.
So like seeing the immediate effects.
Exactly. And then there were correlational studies, where they looked at whether there's a relationship between how much someone uses cannabis and their visuospatial abilities over time.
So are these studies reliable? Like how do we know if we can trust the findings?
Well, good question. The studies that we're focusing on here, they were generally rated as good quality by the researchers who put this all together,
Okay, that's good.
which means that they used good methods, they had comparable groups of people, and they used reliable ways of measuring cognitive function. So we can be pretty confident in the results.
That's good to hear. So what did they find in the experimental studies? Like what happens right after someone uses cannabis?
Well, one study looked at teenagers and adults who were regular cannabis users,
Okay.
and they had them use a small amount of cannabis, about a third of what you'd find at a typical cigarette, through a vaporizer.
Okay.
And then they tested their performance on a task called the N-back paradigm.
What is that?
It's basically a working memory task
Mm.
where you have to remember if the current visual stimulus matches one from a certain number of steps back.
Okay, got it.
And what they found was that both the teenagers and the adults performed worse on this task immediately after using cannabis.
Really? So like right away, their ability to hold and work with that visual information was disrupted?
Yeah, it seemed like there was a pretty direct effect there.
Wow. What other experimental studies did they look at?
They did another one where they gave adults THC.
Okay, that's the main psychoactive
Yeah.
ingredient in cannabis, right?
Right, and they gave it to them under the tongue.
Under the tongue. Hmm?
Yeah, sublingually. And they tested them on two different tasks.
Okay.
One was the Corsi block tapping test.
I've heard of that one. It's like you have to tap a sequence of blocks and then remember the order.
Yeah, exactly. It's a test of visuospatial memory. And what they found was that the people who received THC made more total errors on that test.
So their memory for the spatial locations was worse.
Right, and that effect was more pronounced in women.
Oh, interesting. So there might be some gender differences in how cannabis affects visuospatial processing.
Yeah, it seems possible. The other task they used in that study was a spatial working memory task.
Okay.
And the findings there were a little more surprising. The THC didn't seem to affect the men in the study, but in women, it actually led to a decrease in the number of errors they made between searches.
So for the women, it kind of helped them in a way.
Yeah, it's an interesting finding. The researchers suggested that maybe a follow-up study with a larger group of people would be helpful to better understand that.
That makes sense. So overall, it seems like the experimental studies are showing us that using cannabis can definitely disrupt visuospatial processing in the short term, but maybe the specifics of that disruption depend on the task and maybe even on gender.
Yeah, I think that's a fair takeaway.
All right, so what about the correlational studies? What are they telling us about long-term associations between cannabis use and visuospatial processing?
Well, with these correlational studies, they're not directly manipulating anything.
Okay.
They're just looking at whether there's a relationship between how much cannabis someone uses and their visuospatial abilities, either at one point in time or by following them over a longer period.
Got it. So what have they found?
Well, our sources kind of broke down the findings in a few different ways.
Okay, how so?
First, they looked at whether cannabis use seems to impact visuospatial processing more than other cognitive skills.
All right, so like if it's specifically targeting visual and spatial abilities, or if it's just affecting the brain in general.
Exactly. And the evidence there is kind of mixed. Some studies do suggest that cannabis might be more harmful to visual and spatial processing compared to things like executive functioning or overall working memory capacity.
Okay, what kind of studies are we talking about here?
Well, there's one study where they compared young people who were regular cannabis users. They had to be using at least weekly for at least 6 months with a similar group of non-users.
Okay.
And the only significant difference they found between the two groups was on a task that measured how fast they could visually scan information.
So like how quickly they could look at a bunch of stuff and find something specific.
Yeah, exactly. And they found that those who had started using cannabis between the ages of 12 and 16, they were significantly slower at that visual scanning task compared to those who started later or didn't use cannabis at all.
So that early onset of cannabis use, it might be specifically affecting their ability to process visual information quickly.
Right, that seems to be the case.
Interesting.
No.
What other correlational studies did they find?
Well, there's another study where they looked at adolescents,
Okay.
and they found that the cannabis users in the study showed impairments in their spatial working memory, specifically in terms of how many errors they made and the strategies they used to remember spatial locations.
So kind of like that Corsi block tapping test we talked about earlier.
Yeah, similar idea. But here's the thing. In this particular study, the cannabis users also reported using more nicotine and having more issues with things like misconduct.
Oh, so it's hard to know for sure whether it's the cannabis or those other factors that are driving those differences in spatial working memory.
Exactly. It highlights one of the big challenges with correlational research. It can be hard to disentangle the effects of cannabis from other things that might be going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. What other examples did they have?
Well, they had another study, this one with university students,
Okay.
and they found that women who use cannabis occasionally actually outperformed the heavier users on a visual working memory test.
Oh, that's kind of the opposite of what we might expect.
Yeah, it's a surprising finding, but this pattern wasn't seen in men or on any of the other cognitive tests they used.
Huh. So maybe the relationship between cannabis use and visuospatial processing is more complex than just more cannabis equals worse performance.
Right, it seems to depend on a lot of factors, including gender. And it's worth noting that in this particular study, the heavier cannabis users were also more likely to have tried hallucinogenic drugs.
Oh, so that's another potential confound. It could be the hallucinogens, not the cannabis, that's driving those differences.
Right, it's hard to say for sure.
So we've seen some studies where cannabis use is linked to worse visuospatial performance, but what about the studies that suggest maybe other cognitive areas are more affected?
Yeah, there are definitely some studies that point in that direction. For example, there was a study with adults who were heavy cannabis users,
Okay.
and they found that these folks had impairments in what are called executive functions.
So like planning, decision making, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But there weren't any significant differences between them and the non-users in terms of visuospatial processing or verbal memory.
So for them, it seemed to be more about those higher level cognitive functions.
Right. But again, it's worth noting that in this study, the cannabis-using group didn't have the same proportion of men and women as the non-using group. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of nuances to consider in these studies.
Definitely.
Now, what about the meta-analyses? I know those were mentioned in our sources as well. What are they telling us?
Yeah, meta-analyses are really helpful because they combine the results of lots of individual studies.
So they're kind of like a big picture overview of what the research is saying.
Exactly. And one meta-analysis found that, as you might expect, the more cannabis someone used, the bigger the cognitive decline they experienced.
Okay, so dose matters.
Right. But they also found that verbal tasks tended to be more affected than visuospatial tasks.
Interesting.
And another meta-analysis found that while cannabis use was linked to problems with things like attention, executive function, language, and learning, they didn't see a significant decline in perceptual motor skills, which includes visuospatial processing.
So again, it seems like visual or spatial skills might be a little more resilient to the effects of cannabis compared to some of those other cognitive abilities.
It does seem that way, yeah. But then there was also a study with high school students that found a different pattern.
Oh, how so?
They found that the cannabis users had lower scores in verbal memory, visual memory, and visual spatial ability.
So a bit more of a general decline across different cognitive areas.
Right. It seems like the age of the people in these studies might really matter when we're trying to understand these differences.
Okay, that makes sense. So the next category we're looking at is specifically comparing the effects in the high school students versus adults.
Right. And when we look at that comparison, we start to see a more consistent trend emerging.
And that trend seems to be that younger cannabis users, like those high school students, they tend to show more significant cognitive and visuospatial declines compared to adults.
Exactly. While there will always be some variation in research, that seems to be the general pattern that's emerging. It seems like adolescents and high school students might be more vulnerable to the negative effects of cannabis on their cognitive abilities, including visuospatial processing.
Okay, what kind of studies are supporting that idea?
Well, there were a couple of studies that looked at executive functions, and they found that people who started using cannabis early in adolescence, before the age of 16, they showed greater impairments in those areas compared to those who started later or didn't use cannabis at all. But it's worth noting that some of those studies didn't have an equal number of male and female participants, so that's a limitation to keep in mind.
Right. And what about studies that specifically looked at visuospatial processing in younger versus older users?
Well, remember that study we talked about earlier, the one by Ehrenreich and colleagues that found slower visual scanning speeds in the people who started using cannabis between 12 and 16? That's a good example of that age difference.
Yeah, I remember that one. What other studies did they look at?
There was a really big study that followed people for a really long time, from childhood into middle age.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's a longitudinal study. And they found that the longer someone used cannabis, the more negative the effects seemed to be. And the people who started using earliest in adolescence, they had the most harmful effects on various cognitive functions, including how fast they could process visual information and how well they could learn new visual information.
That sounds pretty concerning, like starting young could really have some long-term consequences.
It does, yeah. But it's important to note that this particular study has been kind of controversial.
Oh, how so?
Some researchers have suggested that other factors like socioeconomic status might have played a role in the differences they observed.
So it's not necessarily a clear-cut case of cannabis use equals cognitive decline.
Exactly. It highlights how complicated this research can be. It's hard to isolate the effects of cannabis from all the other things that could be influencing someone's cognitive development.
Right, right. And that brings us to another type of study that was mentioned in our sources, the stringent studies. What are those all about?
So these are studies that are considered to be particularly strong in terms of their design and the evidence they provide.
Okay, how so?
Well, they might use really large samples of people,
Okay.
or they might follow people over a long period of time, like that longitudinal study we just talked about.
Right, right.
Or they might use twin studies, which are really cool because they can control for genetic and environmental factors.
Because twins share a lot of those things in common.
Exactly. But even with these more rigorous designs, it's still important to carefully evaluate the quality of each study to make sure we can trust the findings.
So what are these stringent studies telling us about cannabis and visuospatial processing in adolescents?
Well, some studies with large samples have shown an association between cannabis use and worse performance on tasks that test spatial working memory. But sometimes those studies have limitations. Like there might be differences between the cannabis users and non-users in terms of their age or their education level or their use of other substances, even if the researchers try to statistically control for those things.
So it's not just about having a lot of people in this study, it's also about making sure that the groups are comparable in other ways.
Exactly. Now here's something interesting. Some of the best designed stringent studies actually suggest that visuospatial processing might be less affected by cannabis use compared to other cognitive or executive functions, like planning and decision-making.
Oh, really? That goes against what we've been hearing so far.
Yeah, it's an interesting twist. There was this one twin study where they compared pairs of twins where one twin used cannabis more frequently than the other.
Okay.
And they found that on 5 out of the 6 different measures of visuospatial processing they used, the twins performed pretty similarly, regardless of how much cannabis they used.
Wow, so even though one twin was using more cannabis, it wasn't really affecting their visuospatial skills.
Right, at least not on most of the tasks. The only exception was a task that measured spatial working memory, where the twin who used more cannabis did tend to perform a bit worse.
So spatial working memory might be a little more sensitive to the effects of cannabis, even in those twin studies.
Yeah, it seems
So
possible.
what other twin studies did they look at?
Well, there was another one that looked at cannabis use in teenagers when they were 17 years old.
Okay.
And then they tested their cognitive function again when they were 23.
So they followed them for 6 years.
Yeah. And they found that using more cannabis at 17 was linked to a small decrease in their overall cognitive test scores at 23. But they didn't find any specific effects on the two visuospatial tasks they included in their assessment.
So again, maybe visual spatial skills are a bit more resilient compared to those broader cognitive abilities.
That's what it seems like, yeah.
Yeah.
But then there's also a longitudinal study that found a sustained decline in spatial working memory in adolescents who had used cannabis a year earlier.
So again, the findings can be a bit mixed, even with these more rigorous study designs.
Yeah, it seems like the specific cognitive skill that's being measured really matters. But overall, I think we can say that the stringent studies are suggesting that visual spatial processing might be less affected than other cognitive functions, although spatial working memory could be a bit more vulnerable.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the last category of studies we're looking at is the abstinence studies. What are those all about?
So these studies are looking at what happens when people stop using cannabis.
Okay, like if the effects are reversible.
Exactly. It's about the potential for recovery. And while some research suggests that there might be some lasting negative effects on cognitive function in general, even after someone stops using cannabis, the findings for visuospatial processing seem to be a bit more optimistic.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah, it seems like there might be more potential for those skills to bounce back. Several meta-analyses have shown that people who have abstained from cannabis, they tend to perform similarly to people who have never used it on most tests of visuospatial processing.
Really? So if they stop using cannabis, their visuospatial skills basically go back to normal.
Yeah, that seems to be the case, especially if they've been abstinent for a longer period of time. One meta-analysis even suggested that just over 72 hours of not using cannabis might be enough for some of the more minor negative effects to reverse.
That's encouraging. What about the experimental studies? What are they showing?
Well, one study found that teenagers who had either recently stopped using cannabis or who had been abstinent for a longer time, they performed better than current cannabis users on tests of memory, verbal memory, and how quicker they could respond to things.
Okay.
But they didn't see a significant difference in visual memory specifically.
So maybe not all cognitive abilities recover at the same rate.
Right. Another experimental study found that when adolescents and young adults stopped using cannabis for a month, their verbal memory got better.
Okay.
But they didn't see any improvement in their attention or on two different tasks that measured visuospatial memory.
Interesting. So even after a month of abstinence, some of those visuospatial skills were still lagging behind.
Yeah, it seems that way.
And what about studies that have compared high school students who have stopped using cannabis with those who never used it at all?
Those studies are usually correlational,
Okay.
and in general, they haven't found any major differences in visuospatial processing tasks between those two groups.
So the kids who used to use cannabis but stopped, they're basically doing just as well as the kids who never used it at all.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. They've looked at things like spatial working memory and the ability to copy complex figures, and those skills seem to be pretty intact in the abstinent group. However, some of those studies have found differences in other cognitive areas, like verbal memory. And it's important to note that some of them didn't fully control for the use of other drugs.
Right. That's been a recurring theme that other substance use can make it hard to isolate the effects of cannabis.
Definitely. But there was a really well-designed twin study where they looked at people who had been abstinent from cannabis for over a year.
Okay.
And they only found one significant difference between the twins who had used cannabis and their co-twins who hadn't. The non-users performed better on a task that measures visuospatial intelligence.
So even after more than a year of abstinence, there might still be some subtle lingering effects on certain aspects of visuospatial intelligence.
Yeah, it's a possibility. But I think the overall message from these abstinence studies is pretty positive. While there might be some initial negative impacts on visuospatial processing during cannabis use, they don't seem to be as long-lasting as the effects on other cognitive functions, and they seem to largely go away once someone stops using cannabis.
Mhm.
But I think we definitely need more research that focuses specifically on high school students and carefully controls for other factors to be really sure about that.
Okay, so let's recap what we've learned in this deep dive.
Right.
It seems like cannabis use, even in high school students who aren't dependent, it can affect their cognitive abilities. It seems to be linked to worse performance in visuospatial processing, especially in areas like spatial working memory, although those effects might lessen or even disappear once they stop using cannabis.
And one really important point is that in some of those studies where they did find significant effects on visuospatial processing, the size of those effects was actually pretty big from an educational standpoint.
Yeah, well,
Like we're talking about medium to large effect sizes, which means the differences between the groups were pretty substantial. We saw that in that study on visual scanning speed and in that twin study on block design, and also in those experimental studies where they looked at immediate effects on the end-back task.
so this isn't just a tiny little blip.
No, it could have real-world consequences for how well these students are able to learn and perform in school.
And our sources also talked about some instructional implications for teachers and educators, right?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I think educators need to be aware of this research and inform students about the potential downsides of cannabis use, especially when it comes to their academic performance.
Okay.
And this is important regardless of what's happening with cannabis legalization. Just because something is becoming legal, it doesn't mean it's risk-free, especially for young people whose brains are still developing.
That's a really important message.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about telling kids to just say no. It's about providing them with accurate information and helping them understand the potential consequences of their choices.
Right, right. What else did they say about instructional implications?
Well, given that the negative effects of cannabis seem to be more pronounced in younger high school students, I think prevention and intervention efforts should really focus on reaching those younger adolescents.
Okay, so targeting those early intervention programs to the kids who might be most vulnerable.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's important to talk to students about the specific link between visual spatial processing and success in STEM subjects.
Because that's where those skills are especially important.
Right. If a student is interested in science, technology, engineering, or math, they need to know that using cannabis could potentially hinder their abilities in those areas.
And that could have implications for their future career choices as well.
Well,
Now, our source also mentioned some limitations of the research and areas where more research is needed. What were some of the key things they pointed out?
one thing they mentioned is that a lot of the research has looked at cannabis use in kind of a broad way,
Okay.
without really taking into account individual differences between people.
Right, like everyone's different.
Exactly. So they suggested that future research should look at how things like gender and someone's baseline cognitive abilities might influence the effects of cannabis on their visuospatial processing.
Yeah, it makes sense that those individual factors could play a role. What else did they mention?
Another thing they highlighted is the need to study the role of cognitive load.
What's that?
It basically refers to how much demand is being placed on someone's working memory and processing abilities at any given time.
Okay.
So like, if you're doing a really difficult task, that's high cognitive load.
Right.
And they suggested that it would be really helpful to understand how cannabis use might interact with different levels of cognitive load. Like, does it affect people differently depending on how challenging the task is?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and they also mentioned that it would be helpful to look at how different types of information are processed under different levels of cognitive load.
Like visual information versus verbal information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's important to consider things like how long it's been since someone last used cannabis and how well rested they are when they're doing these cognitive tasks. All of those things can affect someone's performance.
Right. It's about getting a more complete picture of how all these factors interact.
Exactly.
Well, I think this deep dive has really shown us that this issue is a lot more complicated than we might initially think. The idea that recreational cannabis is totally harmless, especially for teenagers, it's just not really supported by the research.
Yeah, I agree. I think the evidence suggests that we need to be more cautious about cannabis use, especially in young people.
Because even if the effects aren't always huge or obvious, they could still have a real impact on someone's ability to learn and succeed in school.
Right. And I think that raises some important questions for our listeners.
Yeah, like what?
Well, knowing what we know now about the potential effects of cannabis on the developing brain, how does that change your perspective on the increasing legalization and social acceptance of cannabis, especially among young people?
That's a great question.
Think about the skills that are most important for success in school and in life.
Like those visuospatial processing skills we've been talking about.
Exactly. And consider whether the potential risks of cannabis use, even if they're subtle, are worth it.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
This isn't just about saying cannabis is good or bad. It's about understanding the nuances and making informed choices.